Social Psychology Portfolio by Erin McCall-Smith. First, we're going to be looking at the table of contents. Chapter 1, we went over culture and hindsight bias. Chapter 2, spotlight effect and social comparison. Chapter 3, belief perseverance and overconfidence phenomenon. Chapter 4, role-playing and foot-in-the-door phenomenon. Chapter 5, natural selection and personal space. Chapter 6, we went over conformity and normative influence. Chapter 7, peripheral route to persuasion and central route to persuasion. Chapter 8, groupthink and free riders. Chapter 9, prejudice and discrimination. And Chapter 15, misinformation effect and group polarization. Culture. Culture is the enduring behaviors, ideas, attitudes, and traditions shared by a large group of people and are transmitted from one generation to the next. Culture is important to psychology because it shows the common viewpoint of a group of people. Hindsight bias. Hindsight bias is the tendency to exaggerate after learning an outcome, one's abilities to have foreseen how something turned out, aka the I knew it all along phenomenon. Hindsight bias may make results from a study feel like it was common sense after you find out the result. Hindsight bias is when something happens and you're like, oh yeah, I knew that would happen. The spotlight effect is the belief that others are paying more attention to our appearance and behavior than they really are. Timothy Lawrence explored this by having students change into sweatshirts with a logo on the front before meeting their peers. 40% thought the peers would remember, but actually only 10% did. This may make us self-conscious about ourselves because we think that everyone's looking at us and will see our flaws when in reality they're not really paying that close of attention. Social comparison is evaluating one's abilities and opinions by comparing oneself with others. Social comparison explains why students have a higher academic self-concept if they attend a high school with mostly average students. So much of life revolves around social comparison because we spend so much of our time comparing ourselves to other people in an attempt to fit in. Belief perseverance is persistence of one's initial conceptions, such as when the basis for one's beliefs is discredited, but the explanation of why the belief might be true survives. The more we examine our theories and explain why they might be true, the more we become closed-minded to outside information that they may challenge those theories. You see the little snails looking at the little tape. The overconfident phenomenon. The overconfident phenomenon is the tendency to be more confident than correct, to overestimate the accuracy of one's beliefs. Looking into how overconfidence leaks into our social judgment, Dunning and Associates asked Stanford students to guess a stranger's answers to questions like, would you prepare for a difficult exam by yourself or with others? They felt that 75% of the time they were right, when it was really only 63% of the time. Role-playing is role is when a set of norms that defines how people is role is a set of norms that defines how people in a given social position ought to behave. When placed into a new role, it may seem extremely forced at first, and one day it is no longer forced and you fit into that role. So you're playing that role until that role becomes who you are. The foot-in-the-door phenomenon. The foot-in-the-door phenomenon, tendency for people to have first agreed to a small request to comply later with a larger request. Many researchers have confirmed the foot-in-the-door phenomenon with altruistic behavior. Example, Angela Lipstes and others report that ending blood drive reminder calls with, "We'll count on seeing you then, okay?" responded in increasing attendance from 62% to 82%. And the reason that's foot-in-the-door phenomenon is because they've already given blood and now they're giving a request that they'll show up. Natural selection is the evolutionary process by which heritable traits that best enable organisms to survive and reproduce in particular environments are passed to ensuing generations. Evolutionary psychology studies how natural selection predisposes, but not just physical traits suited to particular contexts, but also psychological traits and social behaviors that enhance the perseverance and spread of one's genes. Like the tendency to be a more positive person or a more outgoing person is going to be more attractive to people than someone who's always negative all of the time. Personal space. Personal space, the buffer zone we like to maintain around our bodies. Size depends on our familiarity with whoever is near us. Interesting fact, cultures near the equator prefer less personal space. I must be an outcast then, because boy, I don't want you near me. In public spaces, we respect strangers' bubbles, but we don't mind our friends in our bubble. Conformity is a change in behavior or belief as the result of real or imagined group pressure. There are several varieties of conformity: compliance, obedience, and acceptance are just a few of the examples of conformity. Compliance is conformity that involves publicly acting in accord with an implied or explicit request while privately disagreeing. Obedience is acting in accord with a direct order or command, and acceptance is conformity that involves both acting and believing in accord with social pressure. Normative influence is conformity based on a person's desire to fulfill others' expectations, often to gain acceptance. The want to avoid rejection prompts this type of conformity. Peripheral route to persuasion. Peripheral route to persuasion occurs when people are influenced by incidental cues such as the speaker's attractiveness, when the argument isn't as important as the automatic acceptance. So this is like the Jason Momoa commercial, where people are probably more focused on, oh, that's Jason Momoa and he's, becoming less attractive. The central route to persuasion. The central route to persuasion occurs when interested people focus on the argument and respond with favorable thoughts. This uses more fact than anything else. The argument has to be strong to be able to convince people. Groupthink is the mode of thinking that persons engage in when concurrence seeking becomes so dominant and cohesive in group that it tends to override a realistic appraisal of alternative courses in action. There are 8 groupthink symptoms: illusion of invulnerability, unquestioned belief in group's morality, rationalization, stereotyped views of opponent, conformity pressure, self-censorship, illusion of unanimity, and mind guards. Groupthink symptoms can produce a failure to seek and discuss information that goes into their beliefs. To prevent groupthink, be impartial, encourage critical evaluation, occasionally subdivide from the group, welcome critiques from outside the group, and before implementing, be sure to have a meeting to see if there are any differing thoughts. Free riders. Everyone knows a free rider. Free riders are people who benefit from the group but give little in return. In a group, people are often tempted to free ride off of others and don't put in the effort. A free rider is the person that in a group activity, they don't do anything and they just let the group take care of them. Prejudice is a preconceived negative judgment of a group and its individual members. Prejudice is an attitude. It's when people dislike something. So it's the thought process and not the action. Discrimination. Discrimination is unjustified negative behavior towards a group or its members. Discrimination is the action that usually stems from prejudice. So prejudice, it starts with the belief and stems into discrimination because you're acting off of the prejudiced belief. The misinformation effect. The misinformation effect is incorporating misinformation into one's memory of the event after witnessing an event and receiving misleading information about it. Witnesses may believe a light was actually green when in reality it was red after some suggestive questions. Police and attorneys often ask questions based off their own beliefs that change the eyewitness's memory. This would be like somebody, if you got beat up by somebody without a mustache, and the police believe that this guy with a mustache is the one that did it, so they're like, well, you saw the mustache was red, right? And so it's putting misinformation into your memory. And group polarization. Group polarization is when someone's opinion becomes more extreme when in a group setting. Jury deliberation shifts people's opinions in crazy ways as well. Experiments show deliberation often magnifies initial sentiments. So it would be like somebody going into a jury room and them thinking, oh, they might be guilty, and then them coming out like, oh, they're definitely guilty. And this was the end of my show. Thank you.